Can a single hot dog expose a multi-million-dollar scheme? And what happens when the very founder of a famous hot dog restaurant returns, disguised as an ordinary customer, to find the answer? Autumn rain drizzled steadily onto the narrow street, heavy droplets drumming a rhythmic beat against the rusted metal awning and seeping through cracks in the worn concrete below. Ethan Cross pulled the dark brim of his baseball cap lower, his hand gripping the frayed collar of his weathered jacket against the biting chill cutting into his skin. In that moment, he looked like any ordinary man, slightly lost among the rush of hurried passers-by. No one would have guessed he was the founder of Ethan's Grill, the hot dog chain that once shook up Chicago's street food scene. But today, Ethan wasn't the celebrated CEO gracing food magazines or plastered across glossy billboards. He had come in disguise, as someone else entirely, Noah Kane, a nameless drifter stopping by an old hot dog stand for a quick bite on a rainy afternoon. It was the only way to uncover the truth that polished reports would never reveal. A cold gust howled through the aging buildings, carrying with it the thick scent of frying oil and the clattering of shop signs swaying in the rain. Ethan stood still before stand number 17, one of the very first locations that had built his reputation. The once bright red sign had faded, its letters dulled by time, with only a few dim bulbs flickering weakly above the awning. This place had once been a symbol, a spot where people lined up for hours just to sink their teeth into a steaming hot dog smothered in Chicago's signature golden mustard. Now it looked tired, like an old warrior worn down by too many battles. With every step closer, Ethan's chest grew heavier. The financial report still labeled this location as stable, with only slight dips in sales, but he knew too well how easily numbers could be dressed up. The instincts of a man who had once stood behind the counter, who had turned hot dogs on a sizzling grill with his own hands, told him something was wrong. He drew in a deep breath, forcing his pace to remain calm as he stepped into the cramped space inside. The familiar scent of grilled onions and seared meat still lingered, but in the way it hung in the air, Ethan could feel something missing: the warmth, the rush, the energy that once filled this place with laughter. This stand had been his heart, the memory of his early days when he started with nothing, where he promised himself that every hot dog served would stand for quality and trust. Now, under the clumsy but convincing disguise that fooled everyone around him, Ethan vowed he wouldn't leave until he discovered what was killing the spirit of Ethan's Grill from the inside. And he had no idea that this single, gray, rainy afternoon would change everything, not just the future of the chain, but the lives of the people quietly fighting their own battles in the shadows. The soft jingle of a bell rang out as Ethan pushed the door open, the sound small and out of place in the heavy silence. He chose a seat at the far end of the counter, where a red cushioned stool had a long tear patched with a piece of cardboard. The shop was emptier than he expected, with only a few soaked construction workers eating a rushed lunch and a delivery driver hunched over, checking receipts. Inside, the smell of grilled sausage still carried that signature Chicago flavor, but instead of bringing warmth and familiarity, it hung in the air like a ghost of its former self, weighed down by something invisible. Ethan quietly observed, his eyes settling on the man behind the counter. Luis Moreno. The name stitched onto the tag on his chest was in his early 50s, gray-streaked hair tied back neatly into a small knot. His strong hands still moved with practiced efficiency, flipping sausages on the grill, placing pickles onto buns, but his eyes told a different story. Once used to the hustle of long lines and filled with pride in serving them, now they looked dull and tired, as if someone had stolen his reason to care. Ethan tapped his fingers lightly against the counter as Luis approached. "First time here, huh? What do you want to try?" Luis's voice was low, steady, but lacking the enthusiasm a veteran employee should have had. Ethan smiled casually, playing the part of a curious traveler. "I heard this place used to be really famous. What do you recommend?" Luis paused briefly, something flickering in his eyes, a mix of pride and bitterness. "Of course, the Chicago-style hot dog. It used to be the best here. Used to." The last words were spoken softer, almost like he was talking to himself. Ethan nodded, pretending not to notice the bitterness, though every word Luis said carved deeper into his thoughts. When Luis placed the steaming hot dog on the counter, Ethan picked it up and took a slow bite. The taste was exactly as he remembered: perfectly cooked sausage with a slight snap in the casing, crisp pickles, and a mild kick of mustard. The quality was still there, even excellent, so what was dragging this place down? Ethan glanced at Luis, keeping his tone casual. "Looks like this place used to be packed, right?" Luis only gave a thin, weary smile, one that never reached his eyes. "It was. But now, well, the numbers still say everything's fine, don't they?" In that moment, Ethan didn't need more proof. He knew Luis was hiding something far bigger than slow traffic or declining sales. But he also knew this man wasn't indifferent. In those tired eyes, there was still a faint glimmer loyalty, the pride he once had, and maybe, just maybe, a silent cry for help Luis couldn't bring himself to say out loud. Luis stood behind the counter, wiping a steel tray with an old, worn-out rag, his eyes occasionally darting around the shop as if afraid someone might be watching. Ethan stayed silent, pretending to focus on his hot dog, but he didn't miss a single one of Luis's movements. The silence stretched on, broken only by the soft drumming of rain on the awning and the faint flicker of a faulty fluorescent light overhead. Finally, Luis looked up, his eyes meeting Ethan's curious gaze. In that moment, something in his expression seemed to give way, as if he was too tired to keep his silence any longer. You don't look like a tourist," Luis said quietly, his voice almost faltering. Ethan shrugged, offering a casual smile, keeping up the role of a man who just happened to stop by. "I just wanted something good to eat. But I get the feeling this place used to be a lot more than that, didn't it?" Luis let out a heavy breath, his strong hands trembling slightly as he set the tray down. There was a flicker of hesitation in his eyes, a battle within, before he lowered his head and spoke in a hushed tone. "If you really want to know what's going on here, come back at 4 o'clock, after the shop closes." His words were firm, but laced with unease. Just as Ethan was about to reply, the bell above the door chimed. A man in a delivery uniform stepped in, his shoes still wet from the rain, a clipboard in hand. "Delivery for Luis Moreno," he said briskly. Luis walked over, taking the receipt, his face tightening. 3 deliveries in 1 week? We didn't order this much." His tone was sharp, but the delivery man simply shrugged, replying flatly, "I just follow what the system tells me." Reluctantly, Luis signed for it, while Ethan kept his head down, pretending to eat, his sharp eyes catching every detail. As soon as the delivery man left, Luis quickly shoved the receipt into a drawer, his hand gripping it tightly as if afraid someone might see. And in that moment, Ethan caught a glimpse of something: a crisp white envelope, half hidden beneath the counter. Luis shut the drawer quickly, but not fast enough to hide the truth. This wasn't just about a misplaced delivery or a system error. Through the rain-streaked window, Ethan noticed something else: a black car parked not far from the shop. Tinted windows, silent, like a shadow watching everything inside. Ethan raised his head, calmly sipping his now cold black coffee, keeping his expression neutral as if nothing was out of the ordinary. But inside, every sense was on high alert. The meeting at 4 was clearly not something trivial, and that white envelope might be the key to the real truth. Placing a $20 bill on the counter, Ethan smiled. "The hot dog was great. See you soon." Luis gave a slight nod, his eyes saying more than his words, but all he managed to whisper was, 4 o'clock sharp, and don't let anyone notice you're coming back." Late in the afternoon, the rain had stopped, but the street was still dotted with murky puddles reflecting the gray sky. Ethan returned to the stand at exactly 4 o'clock, just as promised, his steps slow and deliberate so as not to draw attention. The sign had been flipped to closed, and inside, only a dim yellow light glowed through the fogged glass. He pushed the door open, the soft jingle of the bell sounding almost timid, and the scene inside was nothing like it had been at lunch. The counter was empty, no smell of fried onions, no clinking of utensils, just Luis standing behind the counter, his hands resting on the surface, his head bowed as if waiting. Ethan sat at the same spot as before, saying nothing. The silence stretched, broken only by the steady ticking of the clock on the wall. Luis let out a long breath, then slowly pulled a white envelope from the drawer, the same one Ethan had noticed earlier. He placed it on the counter, not opening it yet, his eyes filled with a mix of resignation and caution. "You have to understand," Luis said, his voice low and rough. "I'm not the kind of man who likes to talk too much, but staying quiet, it won't save anyone either." Ethan gave a slight nod, letting Luis continue. Luis opened the envelope, pulling out a single stiff card. Printed on it in cold machine-typed letters was one line: "The stand is underwater. Stop making waves or everyone drowns." Luis read it aloud, his hoarse voice cracking slightly as his grip tightened around the card, his knuckles turning white. "I got this 3 months ago, right after I sent my last report to the company. Since then, my account's been locked, my emails disappeared, and then—" Luis hesitated, a rare flicker of fear showing in the eyes of a man who had clearly lived through plenty. Every morning, a black Audi parks across the street, no plates. Some days the driver changes. Some days it's the same guy. They don't do anything, just sit there, staring at the stand. Ethan leaned back slightly, keeping his breathing calm, though a storm was already brewing inside him. "Who do you think is behind this?" he asked, his tone casual, like a curious customer making small talk. Luis let out a dry, bitter laugh. "I don't need to think, I know. They don't even bother hiding it. It all started when the company signed with Pinewood Logistics. They don't just supply goods, they control everything. And every time I reported mismatched numbers, inflated invoices, I was ignored until this showed up." Luis pushed the card toward Ethan. The dim yellow light cast eerie shadows over the cold printed words, and in that moment, Ethan knew this was no longer about declining sales or delayed maintenance. This was a network, organized and deliberate, an invisible hand tightening its grip around his chain, and Luis, an honest man, was being threatened into silence. Outside the window, a dark shape moved quickly past, headlights briefly flashing across the old sign before vanishing into the dim street. Ethan didn't turn to look, but in his mind, the decision was already made. This wasn't just business anymore. The fight had only just begun. Luis poured himself a cup of black coffee that had long gone cold, his hand trembling slightly as he held it, as if every word he was about to speak could pull him deeper into something far more dangerous. Ethan remained silent, his eyes tracking every movement, not rushing him, letting the quiet stretch. Finally, Luis spoke, his voice low and strained. "You know, everything started changing the moment Pinewood Logistics got involved. At first, they only handled small things, napkins, takeout boxes, stuff no one paid attention to. But then new contracts kept piling in. Food supplies, equipment, even maintenance, all of it shifted to them. We lost the right to choose, and no one above bothered to answer questions anymore." Ethan gave a slow nod, keeping up the appearance of a curious regular customer, though inside every word Luis spoke etched itself deeper into his mind. "What about prices?" he asked casually, as if just making conversation. Luis let out a bitter laugh, the sound dry and hollow in the empty shop. 30% increase in 3 months. But the paperwork? Perfect. The numbers matched down to the decimal. They even listed entire equipment replacements, yet that same broken freezer from 4 years ago still needs a good whack to start. I sent photos, reports. Then suddenly my account was locked. Luis paused, setting his cup down, his voice dropping lower. And then I started noticing things that went beyond simple fraud. Strange shipments like today, 3 deliveries in 1 week for a stand that sells half that stock. I ask the drivers, they just shrug and say, "The system says so." Nobody questions it, like someone higher up is pulling the strings, and everyone else just follows orders. Ethan listened, his calm exterior masking the fire building inside. Narrowing his eyes slightly, he asked with deliberate nonchalance, "So, no one higher up raised concerns?" Luis met his gaze, his own eyes filled with resignation and quiet bitterness. "Everyone knows, but no one dares speak. Remember the envelope I showed you? I'm not the only one." A few friends working at other locations got similar threats. One of them tried sending a full report directly to headquarters. A week later, he was reassigned to Alaska. You think that's a coincidence? Ethan didn't answer. He simply nodded, his gaze drifting toward the fogged-up window. The black car was still there, silent, watching like a predator waiting to pounce. Its headlights blinked once, almost like a warning. Ethan took a slow breath, keeping his tone steady. Do you have any idea who might be behind all this? Luis lowered his head slightly, his voice barely above a whisper. I can't be sure. But rumor has it Pinewood isn't just a logistics company. They're run by someone who got kicked out of a major deal years ago, and now he's back to swallow the very companies that turned him away. In that moment, Ethan clenched his hand under the counter, his mind already assembling the scattered pieces. A name flickered in his thoughts, a name he once called a brother. If that rumor was true, this wasn't just about money. It was revenge, calculated and personal. Ethan looked at Luis, nodding slightly. Thank you. You did the right thing by telling me. But in his mind, one thought burned clearly. Now I know exactly who I need to find. That night, Ethan sat in a late-night cafe, the warm yellow light casting sharp shadows across his face, making him look cold and calculating. His laptop screen glowed in front of him, running through financial data he had quietly accessed using a high-level administrative account he still had hidden in the system. Every chart, every shipping invoice was scrutinized with meticulous care. Numbers flashed line after line, and slowly, the picture emerged. Multiple locations of Ethan's grill were being bled dry, like a vast web tightening around his company. But what made Ethan stop cold was when the list of Pinewood's executive members appeared on the screen. A name stared back at him, hitting him like a punch to the chest. Caleb Ford. Ethan froze, his eyes locked on the screen, his breathing growing heavier. Caleb, the man he had once called a brother. They had built their first hot dog stands together, sharing burnt bread rolls on nights when they could barely afford to eat. But 3 years ago, Ethan had been forced to remove Caleb from the company after rumors of embezzlement and hidden debts surfaced. Ethan had believed it was the only way to save the business, but now, seeing that name, he realized he had sown the seed for this disaster himself. Caleb Ford wasn't just listed as an employee. He was marked as Pinewood's chief strategy officer, and in the internal notes Ethan had hacked into, there was a single chilling line. Priority target, Ethan's grill. Ethan let out a dry, bitter laugh, his eyes hardening like steel. Caleb didn't just want money, he wanted revenge. Leaning back in his chair, Ethan's gaze drifted to an old photo stored in a private folder. It was him and Caleb standing side by side next to their very first hot dog cart, their smiles wide, their hands still greasy from the grill. He remembered that night, Caleb had said, "We're going to build something no one can ever tear down, Ethan." But now, the man who had once shared that dream was the one trying to destroy it piece by piece. Outside the cafe, a gust of wind swept past, rustling old newspapers along the curb. A black car was parked not far away, its headlights flashing once before going dark. Ethan didn't need to look to know it wasn't a coincidence. They were watching him, and Caleb likely already knew he was following the trail. Ethan snapped his laptop shut, his eyes burning with renewed determination. "If you want to play this game, Caleb, I'll play it to the end," he muttered. Deep inside, the fire that had once driven him to turn a simple food cart into a street food empire roared back to life. But this time, it wasn't just passion, it was war. And this war would decide not only the future of Ethan's grill, but also answer the question of who truly deserved to keep that dream alive. The following night, Ethan stepped into the grand lobby of the Meridian Hotel, a symbol of the city's luxury and power. The crystal chandeliers cast shimmering light onto the polished marble floor, reflecting his silhouette. He wore a simple yet elegant dark suit, a sharp contrast to the rugged, unassuming look of Noah Kane from days before. Tonight, He was no longer hiding, no longer playing the role of a passing stranger. Tonight, he was Ethan Cross, and he had come to face Caleb Ford. The bar on the 30th floor was their meeting place. From here, the city sprawled beneath a blanket of sparkling lights, skyscrapers rising like giant crystals against the night sky. Ethan chose a table by the glass wall, sitting in silence watching the city. His pulse quickened beneath his calm exterior. This wasn't just a conversation. This was the moment he needed Caleb to reveal everything in his own words. The door to the bar swung open and Caleb walked in. He looked different, his hair cut short and neat. Dressed in an expensive gray suit, his face carrying the smug confidence of a man who believed he was untouchable. But his eyes hadn't changed, still sharp, arrogant, and now filled with hatred. Caleb approached the table, smirking. "Ethan Cross, what a surprise. I thought you were too busy counting money to care about a dying hot dog chain." Ethan lifted his glass of club soda, calm and unflinching. "You've done well, Caleb. I almost don't recognize my own company anymore." Caleb laughed, a cold, cutting sound. "Don't you get it? This isn't about money. This is about you taking everything from me, my name, my company, my dream. Now I'm just taking back what was always mine." Ethan leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping to a steady, steely tone. "By destroying it from the inside, by threatening people like Luis, that's your idea of taking back a dream?" Caleb shrugged, his expression almost bored, his voice lowering to a dangerous calm. "I've turned your system into a machine that bleeds itself dry, Ethan, and there's nothing you can do to stop it." At that exact moment, Ethan's hand pressed lightly against the small recording pen hidden beneath the table. A tiny light flickered. Every word Caleb had said was now captured. Almost instantly, two men in black suits stepped forward from the bar, flashing federal badges. Caleb froze, his eyes widening in shock. He pushed back his chair, trying to stand, but it was too late. In one swift move, the metallic snap of handcuffs clicked around his wrists. Caleb glared at Ethan, his voice shaking with rage. "You set me up!" Ethan rose from his chair, his gaze steady, his voice cold and unyielding. "No, Caleb, you set yourself up. I just held up the mirror." As Caleb was escorted out of the bar, the city lights glittered beneath them like silent witnesses to the fall of a man who had once shared a dream, but had turned it into betrayal. Ethan watched him go, feeling no triumph, only a sharp pang of regret. A piece of his past was being dragged away in handcuffs, and he knew this battle was far from over. The next morning the sky was a dull gray, and the wind howled through the narrow old streets. Ethan had barely stepped out of his car when his phone buzzed, Luis's name flashing on the screen. His voice was shaky, rushed, almost desperate. "Ethan, the stand's been broken into. You need to get here now!" Without a second thought, Ethan jumped back into the car, the engine roaring as he sped toward stand 17, his heart pounding with every sharp turn on the still wet roads glistening from last night's rain. The door to the stand was ajar, its hinges creaking with every gust of wind. Inside, the scene hit Ethan like a punch to the chest. Papers and receipts torn to shreds littered the floor. The small safe cracked open, its contents spilled everywhere as if someone had deliberately left a message. Luis was on his knees in the middle of the chaos, his hands trembling as he tried to gather the scattered documents, his face pale and drained of all strength. When he looked up and saw Ethan, his voice was hoarse, broken. "They wanted to scare us. And worse, they did something to my account." Ethan rushed forward, placing a firm hand on Luis's shoulder. "What happened?" Luis handed him his phone, his fingers shaking. On the screen, a cold, clinical email from the bank stared back. "Tuition payment declined, account frozen pending investigation." Luis drew a sharp breath, trying to stay composed, but his voice cracked. "My daughter, her tuition, she'll be expelled this semester. Ethan, I can't." Ethan tightened his grip on the phone, anger surging through him like a tidal wave. His sharp gaze swept across the trashed room. This wasn't a simple robbery. Everything was too deliberate, too calculated. Nothing had been stolen except crucial documents. On top of the broken safe sat a neatly placed white envelope as if left intentionally. Ethan tore it open. Inside was a single card printed with a chilling message. "Final warning. The water's rising. Swim away now." Luis lowered his head, his hands clenched so tightly his knuckles turned white, his eyes glazed with despair. Ethan crouched down in front of him, locking eyes, his voice low and unwavering. "Luis, listen to me. We are not running. This is exactly what they want to scare you, to make you give up. But I promise you, you will not lose anything. Not this job. Not your daughter's future." Luis looked at him, eyes wet and trembling, his voice barely above a whisper. "But can you really do it, Ethan? They're too powerful." Ethan placed a steady hand on his shoulder, his gaze like steel, unwavering. "I'm Ethan Cross. I built this empire from nothing, and I won't let anyone destroy it. Trust me, this is only the beginning." Outside, a black car rolled slowly past, its headlights flashing once before disappearing around the corner, a silent reminder that they were being watched. But Ethan didn't flinch. The anger inside him had hardened into a resolve stronger than iron. This was no longer just about protecting a brand. It was about protecting the people who believed in him, starting with Luis and the daughter who now had only one hope left the man standing before him. The next morning, the sky was still draped in a heavy gray, but inside, Ethan burned with determination. He walked into the headquarters of Ethan's Grill, his dark suit perfectly pressed, his eyes sharp as a blade. Employees passing by quickly nodded in greeting, none daring to ask why their usually reserved CEO had shown up so suddenly, radiating such intensity. He strode straight into the conference room, where the executive board sat waiting, faces marked by unease. Ethan slammed a thick stack of documents onto the table, his voice firm and commanding. "Effective immediately, all operations involving Pinewood Logistics are frozen until a full investigation is completed. Any dismissals or staff transfers at Stand 17 are canceled starting now." Several board members exchanged nervous glances. One finally spoke, hesitant. "Ethan, are you sure? Pinewood controls too many of our contracts. Pulling out now could cause significant losses." Ethan cut him off, his tone icy. "Losses? How much have we already lost, letting them manipulate us from the inside? Do you want to keep turning a blind eye while honest employees are threatened, their lives destroyed, just to protect fake numbers?" No one dared to answer. The moment the meeting ended, Ethan stepped into the hallway and dialed Janet, the company's chief legal officer. His voice was calm, but every word carried the weight of an order. "I want a legal team at Stand 17 today. They will audit every invoice, every piece of equipment, and every financial transaction from the last 3 months. Collect every shred of evidence of Pinewood's fraud, and make sure it all goes public." There was a brief pause before Janet's firm reply. "I'll make it happen, Ethan." By afternoon, Ethan returned to Stand 17. Luis stood behind the counter, looking exhausted, worry etched deeply across his face. When he spotted Ethan, he quickly stepped forward, still unsure. "Ethan, they could come after me. You know that." Ethan met his gaze, offering a small but resolute smile. "No one's touching you anymore, Luis. I've frozen every decision affecting this stand. And your daughter's tuition called the school now, they'll have the payment today." Ethan pulled a freshly signed check from his jacket and placed it in Luis's trembling hands. $4,800, the exact amount he needed. Luis stared at the check, his hands shaking. When he finally looked up, his eyes were rimmed red, his voice breaking. Why would you do this for me? You don't have to." Ethan rested a steady hand on his shoulder, his voice low but unwavering. "Because this isn't just a business, Luis. This is my dream, and people like you are its heart. I won't let greedy men destroy it, and I won't let honest people like you pay the price." Luis lowered his head, tears rolling down his cheeks, but for the first time in weeks, a genuine smile broke across his face. "I believe you, Ethan, and I'll help you, no matter what it takes." Ethan squeezed his shoulder gently, nodding once in silent gratitude. Outside the glass window, the sky was still heavy and gray, but inside, a small light had been lit, a promise of justice, a spark marking the beginning of a much bigger fight to come. A week later, the skies over Chicago finally cleared, and sunlight streamed through the fogged-up glass windows of Stand 17, casting a warm golden glow over a place that had long forgotten what warmth felt like. Ethan walked into the stand before the sun had fully risen, not in the polished suit of a CEO, but in a simple rolled-up shirt with an old red apron tied around his waist. He wasn't Ethan Cross, founder of Ethan's Grill, this morning. He was just a man who wanted to grill the hot dogs he had once loved. Luis was already behind the counter, his chef's jacket dusted with flour, his face still showing traces of fatigue, but his eyes were brighter than they had been the last time Ethan saw him, broken and desperate. When he saw Ethan, Luis gave a small, genuine smile, no longer weighed down by hidden worry. "Are you sure about this? It's been a long time since I've seen a boss stand behind the grill," he said with a hint of teasing. Ethan returned the smile, picking up a pair of tongs. "I started here, Luis. Maybe it's time I reminded myself what really matters." The familiar sizzle of hot dogs hitting the grill filled the quiet room, and the aroma quickly spread, filling the air with something that felt like life returning. Ethan laid each hot dog carefully, turning them with precision, as if every single one mattered more than any million-dollar contract he'd ever signed. Luis watched for a moment before laughing softly. "You're too stingy with the onions, Ethan. The customers here love extra onions." Ethan laughed along, adjusting the toppings as directed, and for the first time in a long while, the stand felt alive again. Outside the glass, the sunlight caught the faded sign, making it seem brighter, almost vibrant to those walking past. A few regulars started to gather, whispering quietly when they noticed Ethan behind the counter, but soon they were smiling, the kind of smile this stand hadn't seen in far too long. Luis poured Ethan a cup of black coffee and handed it to him as they leaned against the counter during a short break, watching the street outside. His voice was raspy, but filled with emotion as he said, "Janie, my daughter, called me last night. She cried when she heard her tuition was paid. She said for the first time in months, she feels hopeful again." Ethan was silent for a moment, staring into the cup before replying quietly, "She deserves to have hope, Luis. And so do you. Everyone who's kept Ethan's Grill alive through all this deserves it. We'll rebuild one stand, one person, one piece of trust at a time." Luis nodded slowly, the steady smile lingering at the corners of his lips. Ethan returned to the grill, flipping the hot dogs again, his hands now covered with the smell of onions, mustard, and roasted garlic. But this time, it didn't smell like hard labor. It smelled like memories, like a beginning, and like a belief brought back to life. Outside, the first rays of sunlight bathed the street in gold, a quiet but certain promise. A new era of Ethan's Grill was starting, built again by the hands and honest hearts that had kept the dream alive. A brand is not built from numbers, but from the trust of the people who stand behind it. And only leaders who dare to listen, who dare to stand alongside their employees, can truly keep the heart of a business alive. If you also believe that honesty is the foundation of success, hit like and subscribe so we can share more inspiring stories like this. And don't forget to leave a comment with the 3 words, "Keep the Faith," because that is the most important thing for any dream to survive.